It is officially time for Impact on KLOS. My name is Frank Sontag. Impact, you know, is at times the in-studio guest format where we discuss a wide variety of topics. And tonight I have an in-studio guest who I have had on the program a number of times before. She is founder of an organization called Alive and Well. Her name is Christine Maggiore. And Christine, good morning. For those that don't know about you or Alive and Well, tell our listeners a little bit about your nonprofit.
Well, Alive and Well is an organization that promotes alternative information about HIV and AIDS. We present information that challenges most of the common assumptions we have about HIV and AIDS, including that the tests are accurate and reliable, that the drugs are safe and effective, and that science has proven that HIV is the cause of immune suppression in people who have the symptoms that are called AIDS. And what we offer in addition to information is support for people who are investigating these issues. We offer legal defense for people who make choices that differ from the mainstream and have trouble then in leading their lives because of that. And we have free community events here locally every month. We have free classes and speakers that come in every third Wednesday of every month to West Hollywood Park and meet with us. And people come down who want to learn more about this issue. And we also design and sponsor scientific studies that examine alternative explanations for AIDS and also alternative causes for the diseases that are called AIDS and ways to treat those with non-toxic health-enhancing therapies instead of drugs that harm.
Now, you've written a book in recent years on this very issue, and it's called What If Everything You Thought You Knew About AIDS Was Wrong? Correct?
That's right.
Talk a little bit about the book, and then I've got some questions about it.
Sure. Well, I wrote the book as a way to express what I learned in my search for answers. In 1992, I was diagnosed HIV positive during a routine medical exam. I was given 5 to 7 years to live. I was told that I would need to take drugs that would most certainly make me sick in order to live out those 5 to 7 years I had, and that basically I wouldn't have anything recognizing a normal life. I could look forward to a lot of suffering and illness. And in response to that, I became a public speaker and an educator at AIDS Project Los Angeles. I gave my time to LA Shanti Foundation, speaking on their behalf, and also joined the founding board of Women at Risk. And about a year into my diagnosis and public service, I ran into a doctor who suggested I retest. And when my tests came back fluctuating between positive, negative, and indeterminate, I started looking below the surface of all the information that I was taught and that I was teaching other people about HIV and AIDS. And ultimately, that led to me leaving those organizations feeling that I wasn't really acting in the best public interest by perpetuating the information that I was given, and also led to me writing this book so I could share what I learned with other people, most especially people who need to make informed choices after they test HIV positive themselves. What I've done, from what I've learned, is absolutely nothing I'm supposed to do. I haven't taken any kind of AIDS medicines whatsoever, and I haven't lived as though I'm dying since discovering that I'm not, that HIV tests really can't give us that kind of information. And today, it's been 9 years since I was told I had 5 to 7 years to live. I have a beautiful, healthy 3-year-old son. He was born naturally, and I take no medicines at all and haven't had a need to in any way. And 3 weeks ago, I'm married. So none of the expectations for how my life would be have turned out to be correct. And I find that I'm not unusual. If this were just about me, it would be, an interesting story and that's it. But I work with people all over the world who are HIV positive, healthy, and not taking any AIDS drugs or living the way they're supposed to live according to the rules we've all been taught about this. Most recently, we got a request for information and to set up an organization like ours from the country of Zimbabwe with a man who's been HIV positive just like me since 1992, perfectly healthy, not on any medicines, and he knows lots of other people in his country just like him. So it's not an anomaly that to be HIV positive, healthy, and not taking the medicines. It's just that people like me aren't given a voice.
There is a lot of voice, if you will, in the media that says, and we've heard it for a lot of years, when you hear HIV positive, you hear this, you hear a lot of information about what that means and what you're supposed to do, which is contrary to a lot of the alternative information that makes its way, I don't want to say underground, but there are enough of us that know there is a growing sentiment amongst people that are concerned about this issue that what we're being bombarded in the mainstream is at the very least questionable information?
Oh, it's very questionable. Starting from the diagnosis of HIV positive, I was very shocked to learn that tests that are called HIV tests aren't testing for HIV. They're not testing for the virus. They're not testing for antibodies when they're called antibody tests. What they do is they test the blood for certain proteins, and none of those proteins that are found are unique or specific to HIV. So there's no test out there called an HIV test that's actually testing for HIV or for any unique or specific marker that would indicate the presence of HIV currently or passed through the finding of antibodies. That's a huge thing that is perpetuated in the mainstream media that really has no basis in fact. And then you can just go on from there, from the numbers that we hear in the news recently. There's been lots of talk about rising HIV numbers in San Francisco. The fact of the matter is those numbers were derived during a closed meeting, a private meeting of public officials who adopted a set of estimates that were based on street corner questionnaires and telephone surveys and a little bit of information from anonymous test sites. And they agreed on what would be the new numbers for HIV in San Francisco, which completely defy the epidemiology from the San Francisco Department of Public Health that show AIDS cases declining steadily since 1993. And a paper published by the director of the Department of Public Health in San Francisco, Dr. Mitchell Katz, that using stored blood samples determined that levels of HIV in San Francisco actually peaked back in 1982. So this is the kind of thing you see all the time in the media when you hear these claims that AIDS is rising among America's ethnic minorities. If you look at our own U.S. Centers for Disease Control reports, you see that AIDS in America's ethnic minorities has been declining every year since 1996. So there's a lot of emphasis on harrowing estimates. Those are favored over the hard facts, and a lot of hysteria promoted about this, and I don't know whose benefit that is. It's certainly not to the benefit of people who are diagnosed positive or the people trying to make informed decisions about how they're going to live their lives.
I would concur and want you to talk a little bit about, even though you just did, I want you to talk more directly about the issue of not only hysteria, but fear. There's so much fear around this issue. Even when you hear the word, amongst younger kids that have grown up with this, instantly it's about being terrified.
Yeah. We have a pretty expansive website. It's at questionaids.com. And people are encouraged to send in questions to me. And I get a lot of questions from young people who are just, like you said, terrorized. And it's kind of like AIDS has replaced good old-fashioned guilt about sex, about decisions maybe that you made in a moment of not particular clarity, let's say. But they write to me and they'll say, I had unprotected sex and now I think I'm going to die. My skin itches. I noticed more hair in my hairbrush yesterday. And they're totally terrorized. They want to kill themselves. I've had letters from people who are saying to me, I am going to kill myself because I believe that I may have been exposed because I had unprotected sex once. It's a real terrible thing to put on people. And when you look at STDs in this country, sexually transmitted diseases, you'll see in the period of time known as the AIDS epidemic, more than 25 million cases of STDs like syphilis, gonorrhea, chlamydia, herpes, and very low numbers, less than 500,000 cases of AIDS for the whole period of time known as the AIDS epidemic in this country. So our fears are disproportionate to what the problem actually is. Each year in this country, more people die from cancer, more people die from suicide, and this is more people die in car accidents every year than die of AIDS. So our thoughts about this are really inspired by the reports that we see in the media that are way off base. They're emphasizing great numbers when numbers are small. They're emphasizing this incredible risk of transmission when in fact it is not so. And people are confused and frightened and don't know what to believe when it comes to all of this.
For a number of years, way back from then till now, you've learned a lot about this.
Oh, I've learned a lot. I would never call myself an expert because, I don't know, I think that you have to have special initials after your name and HIV don't count. But I think that my lack of expert status is something that should encourage people because as someone who's not an expert, I've managed to understand these issues enough so that I can talk about them in public. At our last meeting, a biologist showed up and he said, I'm here to challenge you. and asked many questions throughout the course of a talk that I was giving, and I answered every one, and by the end of the meeting he said, well, you've convinced me. I think it's very encouraging that somebody like me can write a book that's adopted into curriculum at universities, that has been printed in 4 languages now, and it's just anybody, I think, that has the basic desire to understand this information and a high school level education can come to their own independent conclusions about this. And this is nothing that I suggest that people follow me on or accept what I say on faith. I think that people need to do their own research and investigation into this. That's why we make our website available. That's why the book is there, so people can come to their own decisions about this, because this is certainly not a philosophy or a belief system that one adopts. It's everybody thinking about this and coming to their own conclusions.
I work out a lot, and recently I filled I got a prescription filled for an anti-inflammatory for, injuries or whatever. The price, without getting specific, was outrageous. Drugs in this country, the pharmaceutical industry, we end up getting charged exorbitant amounts of money for certain drugs. Now, one of the issues as it applies to AIDS, and I even want to get into the whole thing as we call AIDS here, that's even questionable. What does that mean? But for this moment, I want you to comment on the issue of pharmaceuticals, and toxicity is a word that you've been talking about for a lot of years, and really paying the price from the mainstream medical establishment as it applies to this issue, and not really pleased with you saying about the issue of how toxic some of these drugs are. Now it seems as if common perception's starting to change, and they're starting to realize there is something to this word toxic when it comes to drugs. So talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, I think the biggest price that people pay with AIDS drugs are the toxicities, and are what they call the side effects, which are actually direct unwanted effects from these drugs. We've been saying since 1996, myself and other people who are rethinking AIDS, that these drugs were never shown to be effective in people who were not ill. They had very little evidence that they could help people who were ill, that there were no long-term studies. These drugs were basically approved, and I'm talking about these new cocktail drugs that were released for AIDS back in November of 1995. That these drugs were approved based on drug company studies that were unpublished, and that the FDA approved these drugs in a record 42 days without knowing even short-term effects, let alone long-term effects. Now, after we've been saying this for 4 years, these drugs are unproven, there's no long-term studies, they were approved too fast, they're toxic. The mainstream is finally admitting the drugs were approved too fast. We had no data to base giving them to people who simply tested HIV positive but were not sick. We have very little data to show why they sometimes seem to work in some people who are HIV positive and actually have some kind of illness. And also the word toxic now is appearing before the drug therapies every time they're mentioned in print and in the news media. All things that we were saying years ago that people were basically laughing at. And I have in front of me here a publication from a group called Women Alive, in which they list some of the side effects or adverse direct effects of these drugs and are complaining about them. Nausea, facial wasting, that's when your face caves in because of fat displacement, kidney failure, mouth ulcers, hair loss, blindness, peripheral neuropathy, that's a kind of a paralysis that may be temporary or may last a lifetime, lymphoma, a very serious form of cancer, insomnia, skyrocketing cholesterol that's causing young people to have heart attacks and strokes, lumps of fat that form on the back of the neck or around the stomach, arthritis, constant fever, eczema, gas, muscle collapse, psychosis, swollen pancreas, and also death of bone tissue, especially in the hips. Young people are having to have hip replacement surgery because their bones are shattering because of these drugs. Persistent diarrhea, bad breath, body distortion, hallucinations, mental confusion, vomiting, dementia, paranoia, nightmares, severe depression, pancreatitis, kidney stones, liver disease, liver failure, heart attacks, and death. These are the adverse, unwanted effects, often called side effects of these drugs. And 4 years later, after healthy people who simply tested HIV positive on a non-specific and unreliable test were given these drugs and told they had to hit hard and hit early. That was the campaign that started in 1996. They're now retracting that in official statements. Today there was a story in the New York Times, and there have been several stories in newspapers and on news shows across the country, that this was all a big mistake. The evidence wasn't there. The drugs are far too toxic, and they really don't know what they're doing.
To put it bluntly, that's outrageous.
It's not a happy thing.
For years, we've been hearing from the medical establishment about the necessity for drug therapies, and there have been those of you that say, at the very least, question that, and you were lambasted for it.
Oh, yeah.
It's outrageous to suggest that.
Mm-hmm. And now here's from the San Francisco Weekly. A near half-decade of medical missteps, a plague of unnecessary suffering resulting from inappropriate early use of toxic antiviral drugs, and wave upon wave of confusion, dissension, and despair among doctors and their patients. The same article says that the message was delivered that everybody who is HIV positive should be on multi-drug treatment. There was never any data to support that notion. And that statement is coming, according to this article here, from one of the top AIDS drugs promoters in the country, Martin Delaney of Project Inform, an organization that basically informs people about the drug therapies with the bias that they must be on them. So now he's suddenly saying, well, wait a minute, and I've gotten into debates with him and other AIDS activists who, like you mentioned, accused us of being naysayers and party poopers to the great cocktail party when these drugs first came out. But time is showing that we were correct in our assertions. And I'm wondering now if 4 years from now we'll finally hear some admissions that HIV tests aren't testing for HIV, that viral load tests contain a statement as mandated by the FDA that says these tests cannot be used to confirm the presence of HIV infection, which means they're not testing for the presence of the virus. And this is the basis upon which these drugs are given to people, based on their viral load counts, which is not a test that is testing for the virus.
But I want you to talk again about the test, and then I want to get into the whole issue of AIDS and what that means, and is there such a thing as AIDS? But talk more about the test. So what are you saying? When someone says, you meet someone and, okay, I think we're going to be responsible and we need to get an AIDS test, honey, and so let's go do that. What is it you're saying about the test?
Well, first of all, it's not a test for AIDS. It's a common thing to say, but I think if people really think about it, they know that it's not a test for AIDS. It's supposed to be a test for HIV, and that's what it's called, an HIV test. But again, this is not something that's testing for the presence of the actual virus or any specific marker, component, identifying factor that is unique to HIV. These are not specific tests. There's about 60 different conditions that have been noted in the medical literature that cross-react and cause false positives on HIV tests, and they range from herpes, hepatitis, Epstein-Barr, vaccinations, malaria, tuberculosis, which are concerns in developing areas of the world where people are said to test positive in great numbers, and even pregnancy can cause these tests to react positively, not just once, but several times, maybe through the course of your lifetime, because when our body makes antibodies, we retain them to protect ourselves. These are our body's line of defense against illness, so we make antibodies to keep for all our lives. So a person who has never been exposed to HIV can test positive repeatedly, even for their whole life, on these tests because the tests are not specific. There's one scientific study that we make available to people that shows a good percentage of dogs, I don't know what it is offhand right now, I don't have it in front of me, but a good percentage of dogs will test positive for some of the proteins used in these HIV tests. And these are dogs that are not engaging in any kind of risky behavior or using intravenous drugs. These are just normal, healthy dogs. So these tests are certainly not accurate. They're not reliable, and they've never been calibrated, so to speak, against the finding of virus in people who test HIV positive. When these tests were first designed, what they should have done is taken 100 people who tested HIV antibody positive, let's call it, because that's what it's considered, And they should have found out how many of those people had the actual virus in their blood. That's never been done, and it hasn't been done until this day. And people think, oh, well, we have better tests now. There's a saliva test, and there's the enzyme test, and there's this test and that test. All of these tests are calibrated not against the finding of virus in people, but against the original tests that were first created that contain nothing specific that can identify anything unique to HIV. So these are very poorly designed tests. And while I would never tell anyone test or don't test, I just encourage people to know what they're getting into when they decide if they should take that test or not. If they want to take an HIV test, I think they should know it's an idea that that's an HIV test. In actuality, that is not a test for HIV.
All right, we have this term called AIDS. And many people have images in their mind when they hear this word. Talk about, is there such a thing as AIDS, number one?
Well, there's such a thing as AIDS because we decided there was. There was never a disease, AIDS. AIDS is actually a category for a list of previously known illnesses that were put into this AIDS category only to describe relatively common illnesses when they occur in somebody who tests HIV positive. To make that a little more simple, I'm HIV positive. If I have chronic yeast infections, which according to some research that I've been doing about yeast and how common that is in the United States of America, about 30% of all Americans have a problem with chronic yeast. If I have a chronic yeast infection because I've tested HIV positive, that's called AIDS, because that's on the list of what we call AIDS in this country, along with certain kinds of cancers and pneumonias, something called toxoplasmosis. When I was pregnant and HIV positive, if I were to get toxoplasmosis at that time, that would be called AIDS. I had friends who are HIV negative, who were pregnant, who got toxoplasmosis because that happens sometimes to pregnant women. When they had that, that was called toxoplasmosis. However, if I were to have had that while I was pregnant, that would have been called AIDS. So the whole notion that there's a specific disease called AIDS is incorrect. And the idea that the diseases called AIDS only happen to people who test HIV positive is also incorrect. All of the diseases that we call AIDS, all of those conditions, happen to people who are HIV negative, and all of them have causes and treatments that are completely unrelated to HIV. And to make it more clear how AIDS is not a disease, the definition for AIDS changes from year to year and country to country. In 1993, in this country, we changed the definition of AIDS to include people who have a low T-cell count. This is a lab marker that's supposed to tell you how your immune system is functioning. If it hits a certain level, one time only, you can be given a diagnosis of AIDS if you're HIV positive, even though you have no illness, no symptoms of illness, and no disease. You can be called an AIDS case. And since 1993, more than half of all Americans diagnosed with AIDS are not sick with any disease and are not experiencing any symptoms. So when people associate the idea of AIDS with illness, that is not correct, especially since 1993. And what's interesting about that definitional change that we adopted in this country then is that Canada did not. So that means that over 200,000 Americans who've been diagnosed with AIDS based on that non-illness criteria, if they were to move to Canada, they wouldn't have AIDS in Canada because that's not what Canada recognizes as AIDS. Also, Africa has a very loose set of criteria for what is AIDS. You don't need an HIV test in most countries, in most circumstances, and you can get an AIDS diagnosis based on fever, cough, weight loss, and diarrhea, which are symptoms that are indicative many times of parasitic infection, amoeba infection, TB, malaria, living in poverty, being malnourished, starving, the effects of drinking or bathing in unclean water, which are very common problems on the African continent. So AIDS is not a specific illness, and none of the diseases called AIDS only occur in people who are HIV positive, and all of them, every single one, has a cause and a treatment that's completely unrelated to HIV. So it was arbitrarily decided back in 1981 to make this collection of illnesses and call it AIDS, but only in people who test positive. And then as the years have passed, we've added more things to that list.
How do we change someone's mind?
But when it comes to changing minds, that's really not our objective. We're here to encourage people to think, and not everybody's into thinking. Not everybody who's HIV positive and probably should be thinking about the choices that they need to make is into thinking. There are a lot of people who feel very comfortable following the well-worn path, no matter where that path is leading. But there are enough people who want to think about these issues, who want to investigate these, whether they're HIV positive and this affects them directly, or they're just living in a world totally shaped by our perceptions of HIV and AIDS. I mean, when don't you pass a day hearing some news report about the alleged devastation of Africa? When do you not enter into a relationship and have this come up sooner or later? You know, it affects everyone. And there are people who want to think about this in great numbers. People are more hungry for information on this topic probably than others because it's so much a part of our culture. And a lot of people, when they find out that there's another side to this, they're really interested, because for a lot of people, just a few sentences, all of a sudden it starts to ring a little bit true. Those doubts that they had, those things that didn't add up, like, you know, why back in the 80s they were predicting, one of the famous ones is Oprah Winfrey saying that by, I think it was 1995, 1 out of every 5 Americans would be dead in the street from AIDS. USA Today had a big screaming headline years ago that AIDS babies, 1 in 10 babies would be dying of AIDS by now at least. We've had predictions for millions and millions of Americans to be HIV positive and dying from AIDS, and these have never panned out. If you look at young people, I think the grand total of young people in this country, teenagers who's tested HIV positive in the entire period of time known as the AIDS epidemic on this very volatile and unreliable test, is less than 4,000. We've got something like 28 million teenagers in this country. Pediatric AIDS in Los Angeles County, there hasn't been a case in 4 years now. And the grand total from, I think, 1992 until present is about 39 cases in people 13 and under in LA County. Yet we have AIDS organizations here raising millions of dollars.
Hundreds of organizations raising millions of dollars.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at pediatric AIDS, you can't find enough cases to spread out across the country. The number of cases are so small, and most of these children are born to moms who test HIV positive, who are not necessarily ill themselves or suffering from any of the symptoms called AIDS. And when they are immune suppressed, it's most often because their mother has been engaging in some kind of activity that would lead to low birth weight and immune suppression, such as drug use during pregnancy or malnutrition. That's also a huge problem in developing nations. So when you notice these things not adding up, and you hear something like what Alive and Well AIDS Alternatives talks about, or you read something like my book, all of a sudden for a lot of people it starts to make sense that this just isn't making, the predictions aren't being met, the numbers aren't matching up to reality. What they say one day is contradicted the next day, and people start to think about this, thankfully, because it's something I think we all need to think about, because every day in some way everyone is affected by this issue.
I'd like you to talk about what it was like for you when you found out you were going to have a baby. What that's been like from the first time you found out you were pregnant as a woman, and also as it applies to this issue. I mean, you went through hell for a while.
Yeah. Well, being HIV positive and pregnant in this country, you're in a very vulnerable situation, because doctors want to tell you what to do. They don't want to offer you information and let you make up your own mind. They want to tell you what to do, to the degree that oftentimes if you don't follow what they consider the recommended standards of care, you're reported to Child Protective Services, even when you're pregnant, as a negligent parent. And action is taken to take away your child, sometimes even before your child is born. And I deal with this issue across the country. That's why the primary reason for our legal defense fund is to keep children with their parents and return children who have been taken from their parents. On the eve of my wedding, I got a call from a woman whose 2 children were taken by police, HIV positive, perfectly healthy, calling from New York. It was suspected by a new doctor that the children were not being given their daily doses of toxic drug regimens. I explained to her that the treatment guidelines would be changing in a few days, that people who are healthy and HIV positive are no longer having to be told that they must take these drugs. Now, this is all supposed to be a choice, too, mind you.
And we live in America, and we like to think, choice and rights and
she
freedom.
brought this up to her doctor, this changing treatment guidelines, and the doctor's response was to scream at her. When I was pregnant, what I found is that I called for weeks. OBGYNs, birthing clinics, even the most open-minded birthing clinics, people were saying, hey, at this one day, artificially inseminate lesbians, they'll take you, you're just HIV positive. And no, nobody wanted me there to have my baby unless I agreed to be on toxic drugs that cause fetal deformities, cancer, and all kinds of terrible things. They destroy DNA chains. I mean, a baby's growing inside of me. Why do I want to take that? There was no way I was going to do it. I ended up finally having my son at home with a certified nurse midwife, and she didn't even want me to have the baby at her birthing clinic. I had to have him at home, which turned out to be a great thing. But, you get tired of feeling like some kind of a social medical leper because you're making decisions that are well-founded and well-researched that happen to not agree with the fashionable ideas this week about HIV and AIDS. I mean, we see these ideas changing all the time. But also, on 2 different occasions, AIDS activists tried to report me for being a negligent parent because of my decisions. And when you say the hell I went through when I was pregnant, I mean, internally, I knew that if I didn't have the most perfect baby and the most perfect pregnancy, probably somebody would set my lawn on fire. And thankfully, I had a perfect pregnancy and a beautiful, perfect baby. I mean, my son's health is enviable. He's just amazing. But that pressure that I had to be under, and also, too, the hell of anytime there's a knock on my door during the day and I don't have an appointment and I don't know who it is, my heart races a little bit because of all the people that I deal with across the country who have a knock on their door, and it's the police coming to take their children away because they've decided to decline toxic AIDS drugs for themselves and their children and to lead healthy lives.
It's, for me, from the outside looking in, not even obviously living your life for a moment, it's incomprehensible that it's gotten to this place.
How it gets here is erroneous media reports that whip up the hysteria, AIDS activists trying to pump this up into a bigger problem than it is and keep this constantly in the news to perpetuate the bad news over the good news. Who's talking about declines? No one. AIDS has been going down in this country in general since 1993 in the city of San Francisco, where it's supposed to be rising since 1993. We've had no cases of pediatric AIDS in Los Angeles County in 4 years. Do you ever see a news report celebrating that? No. All we hear is the bad news to whip up the funding and keep the whole notion of AIDS just moving ever forward. And when it's not happening here, what do? We turn our focus to Africa. And again, it's so much of the same thing, harrowing estimates over hard facts. In South Africa, I just saw a report on the news before I came here this evening. 10% of the population of South Africa is estimated to be HIV positive. Well, that really stands in contrast to the number of AIDS cases in South Africa. In the last 20 years, there have been less than 15,000 AIDS cases in the entire country of South Africa, yet there's supposed to be 4 to 5 million HIV positives and 200 a day becoming, quote, infected.
And you spent some time there at the end of last year.
Oh, yeah. And when I was there was a big news report, young, gifted, and dead. That was supposed to describe the young people of South Africa, how they would lose an entire generation, and they had these graphs and charts on the front page of a paper. And I was there as a participant in the 13th International AIDS Conference there, and I was with a professor of African history who's also a historian and who's really great at math. And he took out a little golf pencil and was checking these charts. And what these charts actually showed is that death in Africa, in South Africa, from all causes among both sexes, all causes including AIDS, annually is 0.8%, which is amazing for a developing nation because that's about equal to that of the United States. Infant mortality has not increased at all during the time known as the AIDS epidemic in South Africa, and the population there continues to grow steadily at 3% annually. So why that news report? Right there on the front page of the paper, anybody could have taken out a calculator and figured the same thing out for themselves. But unfortunately, we get stuck on the emotional issues, the fear. Our compassion is inspired by this, and we want to do something to help these people. Well, when you have a nation of people, 60% of black South Africans don't have jobs, don't have enough to eat. We visited hospitals. People are dying of starvation. If you don't have clean water, how are you going to swallow your toxic AIDS drug anyway? And if you took AIDS out of South Africa, you would still have an entire nation that is really challenged by economic strife and the ability to clothe and feed and have basic medical care for its people. Importing drugs at billions of dollars a year is not creating an infrastructure, not feeding people, not educating them on how to get jobs, and it's not giving them basic medical care so they don't end up really sick.
I want you to share with me what you shared off the air with me about this article and about this notion that healthcare practitioners that may be subjected to this, and they were told, well, this is what you need to do. This is a good idea. And it sounds like I don't want to say a bad movie, because this is real life and we're talking about people.
Yeah.
But this is outrageous.
That's pretty outrageous. What this is a news report from January 4th on, it says, U.S. issues warning on one use of anti-AIDS drug. And this report is specifically about a drug called nevirapine or Viramune. And this is the drug that's being pushed to be used for pregnant women in South Africa. And what they discovered was that in healthcare workers who feared that they had been stuck with a needle that may have been in somebody who tested HIV positive or had a diagnosis of AIDS, they were told to take this drug to prevent alleged transmission of HIV. Well, after a couple years of using this drug, and this is all voluntary reporting, there was a great number of cases of serious side effects, mostly affecting the liver toxicity, and even liver failure, requiring one healthcare worker to get a liver transplant. Now, normally you see somebody who's had a lifetime of abuse to their liver requiring a liver transplant, not somebody who's been taking a prescription drug for a few weeks for supposedly a good thing to prevent an illness. You see a liver transplant going to somebody who's just completely destroyed their liver. That's how harshly toxic these drugs are to the liver and other vital organs. And what's interesting, too, about this article, it mentions, after all these years of hearing, just one needle stick and you could become HIV positive, just one needle stick, still, according to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, we have a grand total in about 20 years of 25 healthcare workers who have AIDS who claim that it's not thoroughly investigated that work-related exposure is why they have an AIDS diagnosis. So 25 in 20 years, and this article says that the risk of HIV transmission in this setting of healthcare workers is very low, and in most cases, taking the drugs, it's not even worth that risk. So, it's again a situation of years and years of hearing just once, just one time, just one needle stick, and now, hey, the risk really isn't there. Maybe you shouldn't take the drugs because they might cause you to end up dead.
It's outrageous.
Times change.
And I want to try to do that portion of the program now and start taking calls. So we have Tom.
Okay, speaking of alternative treatments.
I think with regard to your question, the most important thing is to treat people as people. Just because people test HIV positive, it doesn't suddenly make them all the same. And that is how mainstream medicine sees people who test HIV positive. If you're 23 years old and you've had sex with one person and you've lived a healthy life, if you're 50 years old and you've been shooting drugs for 20 years and living on the streets and haven't been living a healthy life, and you both test HIV positive, you're treated the same. You're given the same drugs, the same kind of prognosis. And that's not the way it should be. People should be treated based on their unique and individual health histories and health issues. And most people in this country that get an AIDS diagnosis and test HIV positive have no health issues. They have no health challenges. So treatment becomes a more complicated question. What are we treating? The notion of HIV, because these tests aren't even testing for HIV, And the drugs that are suggested by the mainstream are supposed to be anti-HIV drugs, but we see that they're wildly nonspecific from all the different side effects they cause. What we suggest at Alive and Well AIDS Alternatives is that people see a health practitioner that regards them as a unique individual person, looks beyond their HIV diagnosis, and searches for what may be the cause of any health problems they're experiencing. And I'll give you one quick example. There was a person who was wasting away suddenly after being HIV positive and not on any medicines for 10 years. AIDS doctors, of course, wanted to say the AIDS kicked in. He pursued that further, knowing that HIV, for him anyway, could not be the source of his problem, found that he had a colon condition that was hereditary, had surgery, recovered, and is fine. Had he followed the mainstream, where everybody who's HIV positive is rotated between 14 different so-called antiretroviral drugs, he would have never resolved his health problem. So that's what we suggest, is that people see health professionals that see them as people, not just HIV positives, and get to the root cause of whatever health problem they may have. And many people who test positive, many people given an AIDS diagnosis, don't even have health problems.
Tom, I thank you for the call this morning. We've got Mark, Phil, Austin, and Matthew are the next four callers. Christine, we also had a man named Jim who is not there. He wanted to know, the question was, which organizations or companies are spreading rumors that AIDS is on the rise?
Gee, who isn't? That's a tough one. Every major media outlet, every AIDS organization, except, ours and organizations like ours that raise questions and look beyond the headlines. I don't think there's an organization regarding AIDS or a government agency regarding AIDS that isn't claiming that it's a constant problem. And when they can't do it with hard numbers, what they do is percentages. You can make decreasing numbers seem like increasing numbers if you express them with percentages. And if you'll notice, a lot of news reports don't give hard numbers but give percentages.
I know for me, if the question was posed to me, it seems as if I can't open up a newspaper or have access to just about any mainstream channel where you don't hear the word epidemic. It's always equated in there, and yet who's questioning that? What does that mean? Epidemic, that obviously means that this is rampant, and people that are well informed know it could be further from the truth.
Thank you.
We appreciate the call. Phil was next, and I guess we lost him. He wanted to know, and this is a question that is pretty popular, what is the percentage of persons with HIV who end up having AIDS?
Depending on what country you're in, it's generally speaking a very small percentage, and oddly, in countries where people have very little access to medical care, those are the countries in which the smallest percentage of HIV positives go on to develop AIDS. Also, too, no one is doing any kind of research or study into people like me who test HIV positive and are perfectly healthy. We are not called upon to participate in research studies. Nobody's looking to quantify the number of us who exist or what it is that we do or don't do that allows us to be HIV positive and healthy in defiance of all the well-laid rules that they have for HIV equals AIDS. And so that's a difficult question to answer, not because it's not a good question, it's a very important question, but unfortunately no one is doing research into that aspect of this.
Phil, I thank you for the call. And Austin, you're on the air on KLOS with Christine Maggiore.
Hi, Frank.
Hi, Austin.
How you doing, Christine?
I'm okay, thanks.
I'd just like to say I'm sorry to hear you got the disease, or whatever you call it. You say it's not a disease, right?
Well, it's basically a social stigma and a pain in the hiney.
I had three questions or comments on something you said. You said that they call it AIDS, but it's really not AIDS. It's several, if I understood you correctly, several different forms of sexually transmitted diseases that you get?
No, actually, none of the diseases in the category AIDS are sexually transmitted, as I recall. It's stuff like cancer, pneumonia, yeast infections, salmonella. You can get that from eating eggs that aren't cooked or chicken that's undercooked. And if you're HIV positive, that could be called AIDS. AIDS is not a disease itself. It's a collection of previously known conditions that can happen to people who are HIV positive, that can happen in people who are HIV negative, and all of these conditions called AIDS have causes and treatments that are totally unrelated to HIV.
That's unreal. So you're saying that there's several different things that can cause it?
Well, tuberculosis is caused by the tuberculosis bacteria, and that's an AIDS disease if you're HIV positive. If you're HIV negative and you have tuberculosis, you have tuberculosis. And the sad thing about that is if you have TB and you live in Africa and you test HIV positive, you don't get TB medicine because there's not enough to go around, and they consider people who test positive as dying, so they don't get a fair chance to get better and live. They're told that they can't have medicines, and so it's a very cruel way of categorizing health and wellness.
Yeah, that's probably why we have to get inoculation shots when we go in their country, because it's so different. But I was wondering, you said something about HIV testing. You were saying, like, say you get a test, it might not show up tomorrow, or it shows up, or it might not show up.
Well, actually, what I was saying is that the HIV tests are not testing for HIV. They're not testing for the presence of the virus, and they're not testing for anything that is specific or unique to HIV. All of the tests that are currently in use do not test for HIV itself and are not able to identify anything that uniquely or specifically describes HIV or any component of HIV. So we call it an HIV test, but in reality, if it's not testing for HIV or anything that specifically describes it or is unique to HIV, it really isn't an HIV test. That's what I was saying.
Do you believe that you can get it, though, through I think I heard you say something about saliva and teardrops, sweat, and stuff like that?
I did not mention saliva, teardrops, and sweat, and I don't...
Saliva, I thought, because I just want to say when I was in Hawaii back in 1985, these friends that I was staying with had a radio in the bathroom, and when I turned on the light switch, that's the first thing you heard was the radio. And they said that it was proven that you can get AIDS through blood, sweat.
We've heard a lot of things that say it's been proven that. I mean, there's a lot of, I don't know how long you've listened to the interview, Austin, but we have a lot of mainstream information that says maybe what's true today or what's proven today, you know, a year or 5 years down the line, we're going to hear something completely different. In other words, the story has changed many times.
Right.
And a lot of these are assumptions that have no basis in scientific fact. Just think about it for a minute. If it was passed through sweat, everybody who ever entered a gym in, you know, the area, let's say West Hollywood, for instance, where there's a large population of people who test HIV positive, I mean, the people who work there, it's preposterous. That's right up there with mosquitoes and sneezing. And, it's not founded in scientific fact, and all those ideas do is whip up hysteria, make life difficult for people like me who test positive, make people more afraid of other people, and make people want to be more compliant with rules that don't make any sense about this whole thing. So I strongly suggest that you visit our website at questionaids.com and really take some time to look at this information and think about it.
I just want to say one thing, too. I can't remember her name. I don't know if you guys would believe this or not because of what I just said about, several different ways that several different diseases that could cause AIDS. There's an Australian doctor that she studied AIDS, and she said every time they came up with a means to combat AIDS, it eluded in several different directions.
Do we have a name for this doctor?
Well, if you call Calvary Chapel, it's on this.
Well, I think really the point here is that that's a common statement, that the HIV virus is so wily, so clever, it works like a thief, it can crack codes, it can leap tall buildings in a single bound, and all this other stuff, when actually what HIV is supposed to do is it's supposed to destroy the human T cells of the immune system. Yet I have in front of me a government report that mentions the fact that what we call HIV is grown in human T cells, immortal T cells that are never affected by the presence of what is called HIV. So this whole idea that it's wily and tricky and all this other stuff, it's basically to kind of make a way of explaining the fact that none of the drugs that are supposed to be working against HIV are doing much of anything to help people actually recover their health and get better. So we talk about the virus in all these terms to try to make an explanation as to why all of our approaches in the mainstream are not working to really help people.
Austin, I thank you for the call. We've got Matthew, Sarah, and Scott will be the remaining three calls here. Matthew, you're on the air on KLOS with Christine Maggiore from Alive and Well. How are you, Matthew?
I'm fine. Hi, Frank.
Hi.
Hi, Christine.
Hi.
I have a quick question. Actually, the last caller, the beginning of his question kind of is serving to set this up. I have a disorder called ITP, and that stands for idiopathic thrombocytopenia. It's a blood disorder, but it's pretty related to the immune system. And earlier you had talked about a list of conditions that fall under AIDS. You know, you mentioned yeast infections and cancers and things like that. I wanted to know if you knew if at any point that particular disease, ITP, ever came up on any list.
Well, I know that thrombocytopenia is one of the side effects of AIDS drugs.
Okay.
So, and what's the other one? Pancytopenia, which basically means, if you look at the Latin derivations of that word, it means death of all cells. Mm-hmm. And these are the side effects of the drugs that are supposed to be protecting the cells of the body against the onslaught of HIV. So it's interesting how the treatment drugs actually, AZT and other drugs like it that are used in these combination cocktails today, cause 5 of the principal AIDS-defining illnesses recognized in this country, including lymphoma, muscle wasting, life-threatening diarrhea, T-cell depletion, which is how we define AIDS, and dementia.
Yeah.
So these drugs, in addition, also cause thrombocytopenia, like you mentioned.
Interesting. Okay.
I'm sorry you have that.
Well, yeah, me too. But I actually just got treated for it, and so I mean, I've been dealing with it for a few years, but I just had a splenectomy, which is the common treatment for it, and so far it's working like a charm. So.
Oh, good.
So we'll see how that goes. But
okay.
I just wanted to know if perhaps that particular illness had shown up on that particular list at any time.
Well, you know, I don't have the list in front of me, and it's possible that it could have, because a lot of the drug side effects end up appearing as AIDS illnesses.
Okay.
So.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Matthew.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye. Sarah, you're on the Impact program on KLOS with Christine Maggiore.
Hi, Frank.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Christine.
Hi.
I'm just so glad that somebody is finally speaking up. And, I mean, I've been telling people for years about, you know, things that I learned by reading, and they would back away from me like I'm crazy, you know, and say, oh, if you don't think you can get AIDS that easy, you know, you're crazy. And I have 2 questions, and the second one is more important than the first one. The first one is, I'm wondering, what about the statistics that are given, and what about all those people who never take any kind of test and live all their lives HIV positive, but no one ever knows that? And I'm wondering how that might affect the given statistics. In other words, I believe that there's probably a lot of people who live long, healthy lives that just don't know that they're HIV positive. And my second question is, I was wondering if you might address the issue of intravenous drug users and the efficacy of needle exchange programs and how that might be affecting the whole situation.
Now, those are interesting questions. It's hard to know how many people out there test HIV positive. And again, while this certainly is not a test that you could say tests for HIV, going by the notion that somebody who tests positive has a shortened life expectancy and requires the drug treatment, it would be interesting to know, you know, what the status of all Americans might be, and to test people who are older and find out. But like I mentioned to an earlier caller, those of us who are HIV positive, healthy, and not in treatment programs and not taking the medicines and not seeing AIDS doctors with their very narrow focus are not the subject of study. We're not given a voice. We're not counted. So it's very difficult to know that. I know through my experience that there are so many people all around the world. I mentioned earlier we had a request to start up a branch of our organization in Zimbabwe from somebody who tested HIV positive, has not taken any treatment drugs the same year as me. We have another branch of our organization in Zambia, led by somebody who's HIV positive, healthy, has not taken treatment drugs, and has been positive for 10 years. His wife is positive. They just had a little healthy baby. So it's quite common, yet nobody's counting us. With regard to your second question about needle exchange, interestingly, there have been studies that show that HIV positive rates are higher among people engaging in needle exchange programs. And again, I think we need to look at not so much the needle, but what's in the needle,
yeah.
and what people are doing. Most people who are using injection drugs are sacrificing their health, their living standards, the conditions under which they exist, everything to be able to get drugs. These certainly are not healthy people. And I have had letters from people who run treatment programs for former IV drug users, and also there is medical literature that shows the same thing, that when you take somebody who's an injection drug user for many years, you treat them for what is common malnourishment, even though they're HIV positive, they will go on to lead perfectly healthy lives as long as they don't live with the idea that HIV is out to kill them and they must take strong and specific action against that.
Right. Okay. I appreciate your answers. I was just going to mention that, yeah, I lived with a man for many years that was HIV positive. When I met him, he told me that he was dying of AIDS, and luckily enough, by the time we parted ways, he would say that he was living being HIV positive. He wasn't dying of AIDS anymore. And just because of having been with him personally and going to the infectious disease specialist with him and doing a lot of reading, and finally got him to change his whole treatment program. And as far as I know, he's still alive and well to this day, and that's 20 years I've known the guy.
Wow. Yeah, I know a lot of 20-year veterans of HIV positive test results who have not followed the treatment protocols and are just treating themselves as people who have the right and the ability to live in health, and they do.
Right, and I agree with the whole thing. I'm really glad for what you do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye. We'll take one last call, and Scott, you're on the air with Christine Maggiore from Alive and Well.
Hello there. Have a question. I've had 4 or 5 HIV tests, and what is the correct test to have done? I want to make sure that I've been having the right one.
Boy, Scott, if there were a test that tested for HIV, I'd be happy to tell you about it. But unfortunately, none of the tests that are called HIV tests are tests for HIV. And I want to share something interesting with you. Recently, I was filmed for a segment of 2020 that should be airing sometime this month or next month. And as part of the segment, they wanted me to take an HIV test on camera, because certain AIDS activists have claimed that I'm HIV negative and I just do this, I don't know, to get attention or something. So I agreed to take a test on camera if they would fund my taking a viral load test, because I haven't had one of those in a long time. And I know they don't test for the virus, but I just wanted to know where my level was so I could talk about it with people and show them. I've had viral load levels as high as 365,000 and not been sick, and yet up until a few weeks ago at 10,000 you were supposed to start drug treatment. Now they say 55,000, and I've surpassed that also. But anyway, when I went in to take the antibody test, as they call it, and the viral load test, as they call it, I wanted both done at the same time. The clinic where I went said, well, wait a minute, if you haven't tested antibody positive, then you can't have a viral load test. And I said, why not? It's being paid for. If I give you $195, I should be able to take a viral load test. And they said, no, we can't do that, because the viral load test is so sensitive that it will pick up virus. It will read as virus stuff that's in people who test HIV negative. So we can't give that test to people who are HIV negative because it causes a lot of upset and trouble. Wow. So rather than, the way normally you make sure a test works is that you test it in a population not affected by the problem. That's called a control group or something in science. Yet in this instance, because the test is so nonspecific, we just say, oh, well, you can't use it in people who are HIV negative because, it only works in people who are positive, and then whatever that test happens to pick up in people who are positive, well, gosh darn, that's virus. But if it picks it up in somebody who's negative, it's a mistake. And there's lots of studies in the medical literature showing people who are HIV negative who've had viral loads. So don't be taken in by the idea that you can go out and get a test for virus. That is not correct.
Thank you, Scott. The whole idea of testing, you were the first person that really got it through my thick skull, because I'm kind of a skeptical person anyway. I want to test, and therefore this is proof. And yet you've said on this program for many years, hey, this whole notion of test you should question anyway.
Well, it's hard because I think all of us want to be responsible.
Sure.
And everybody feels more comfortable with a yes or no answer, certainly. In all these years of being told, it's the right thing to do, it's what you need to find out, find out your HIV status, and you get in relationships with people and they want to know, what the heck do you do? It's really difficult. But the fact of the matter is that these tests aren't testing for HIV, anything specific or unique to HIV. Why they're called HIV tests, you know, it's kind of like a marketing name more than anything else. And people say to me, you know, should I test? And I say, I think you should find out what the test you're thinking of taking actually can and cannot do, and then make up your own mind. And sometimes I tell people, you know, hey, if you feel comfortable with the idea that you're taking a test for HIV and you're happy to live with whatever result comes up, knowing that that isn't a measure of actual virus, then take the test. For most people, it'll come back negative. And so, you know, it's whatever they want to do is fine. But I think people really need to understand that, because when you do get a positive test result back, it is life-altering. Even if you know everything that I know and that other people know about this, you live with the social stigma, the pressures. You know, people say to me, well, you know, Christine, if you don't think that testing HIV positive necessarily leads to AIDS, if I'm positive, do I have to tell people before I have sex with them? And I always say it's really important to disclose that information, because you have to think of how other people perceive this, what their fears are, what their misconceptions or ideas are about this. And also there's the law. So even if you're HIV positive and you know the facts about this matter, you feel comfortable living your life as a normal, healthy person, unfortunately, we live in a society that doesn't adopt that viewpoint readily. So you have to take into consideration other people's views and the law with regard to this. Can I mention something kind of funny?
Absolutely.
Monday night, I got a call that there was a program on CBS television, Judging Amy, and it was an episode about a woman who was HIV positive, a mother, ran an alternative AIDS organization, had written a book about HIV and AIDS that raised a lot of questions about the veracity of what we're told, and who had been taken into court for choosing to breastfeed her child. I thought that was really interesting, because it's basically, it sounded like a program about me. Mm-hmm. And what was interesting about the approach of the program is that this fictitious person had a doctor testify on her behalf that there was no medical evidence that HIV was the cause of AIDS, that there was no scientific evidence that HIV virus, had been found in breast milk. And the judge sympathized with this woman, but decided that she had to go with popular medical opinion and could not support her contrarian views, so to speak. But I thought that was really interesting that made it on the air and how that was handled. It's a show called Judging Amy. I don't watch television really, so I'm not familiar with it, but I got a couple calls from people about that, and I thought that was really odd, because, you know, I mean, HIV Positive runs an alternative AIDS organization, has a kid, wrote a book. I mean, gee, sounds a little familiar.
I've got one last question, and then anything you want to provide in closing, in terms of a closing comment, feel free to do so. I want to know how Charlie's doing.
Every once in a while I stop and think that he might not have been here had I not had, I can't even say the courage to pursue this. It was a twist of fate, because I almost didn't have my child because of the pressure that I felt to live as an HIV positive mother, and what the ramifications would be for my son. I mean, how would the world regard him? I almost terminated my pregnancy, and it was through an amazing, magical twist of fate, a misread ultrasound, that I ended up not doing that and having my son. And every day of my life, I am so thankful to whatever benevolent forces in the universe made that ultrasound screw up, because he is just the greatest joy of my life. I learned so much from him. It is so wonderful to be a parent. And I find that when people in our neighborhood, they see Charlie, they know about me and my work. I mean, I'm very open about all of this, so everybody knows who knows me. And they see Charlie and they hear the news and information, and they can't hold both of those things in their head at the same time. When they see this vibrantly healthy little kid who he's never had any of the problems that their, quote, normal children have had, and they have to let go of all the ideas about HIV or defy what they see in front of them every day. And thankfully, my friends and neighbors, they just see Charlie for who he is, just this bright, wonderful, healthy child. We have a pediatrician who totally supports that. And he's just, you know, tearing up the world, and it's great. And I hope that by the time he grows up, that we will have come to some realistic assessments of what is going on with regard to HIV and AIDS, and have put this into its proper perspective and be directing our efforts based on sound scientific fact and reliable information, and that he can live in a better world than we're living in now with regard to all of this. But for a lot of people, he kind of symbolizes the possibility of life for people who test HIV positive, because I was told very clearly, you can't have kids. And my heart goes out so much to people who test HIV positive and they're told, oh yeah, you can have kids as long as you're on drug therapies. My goodness, what we see with these drug therapies in children, it is just heartbreaking. They say that HIV positive children don't grow normally, but these are the ones that they're looking at who are on these drug therapies, that their growth stops at a certain point. Or, HIV causes them to have XYZ problems. Well, these are all children on the drug therapies. The HIV positive kids I know, probably because their parents are so well informed about issues of health, are the most vibrantly healthy, gloriously alive, fiercely intelligent kids you could ever hope to see. And it just breaks my heart when I hear about people who think because they've tested positive they can't have children, or the only conditions they can have children under is toxic medicines throughout their pregnancy, cesarean section at birth, AZT transfusion during labor, follow-up with AZT after the birth, and formula feeding. Women are told they can't breastfeed. I chose to breastfeed my son after doing a lot of research into this. It was not a decision I made lightly, but the fact of the matter is there is no evidence that HIV is in breast milk. I chose to breastfeed my son for the benefits of living food that changes with his growing needs. It's exactly what a little boy needs to develop his brain. I mean, it's so important for his immunity and everything. And the result is just this wonderful child, and as I've gone on and on, you can tell I'm so proud of him. And I'm so happy that he's in my world. It just, it's like sunshine every day.
That's wonderful. Anything else you want to share in closing?
Oh, gosh, haven't I gone along? I don't know. I just really hope that people can open up their minds and their hearts to consider alternative viewpoints. There's nothing wrong with skepticism, with questioning, with investigation, with learning. Certainly, we can't come up with answers unless we're asking questions, and when our questions are limited, so are our answers. And I think it's really important. I mean, even given the fact, those who hold most fervently to the common perceptions of HIV and AIDS with these shifting treatment guidelines and the new admission that these drugs are highly toxic, maybe that's opening a little space in their minds for them to consider other viewpoints. We consider, as thinking human beings, the other side of so many issues, yet so many thinking, caring people are of the impression that there's one side to AIDS. There's never one side to any issue. I just really encourage people to look into this and do so with the idea that learning is a good thing, that questions lead to answers, and that understanding means we can really help people. And that's what Alive and Well is all about, is just getting down to really helping people, to getting a realistic assessment of what's going on, to enable HIV positives to be treated as people, and to, allow people to live lives that are free from unnecessary fear, free from unnecessary medical intervention. And I think that's a right that we all have it and that we should exercise.
It's always wonderful to see you and hear you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate this forum.
Absolutely.